Greetings from Williamstown. On behalf of everyone here at the college, it's my honor to welcome you tonight to tonight's event, a celebration of 2021 Bicentennial Medalist, Dr. Craig Smith, Williams class of 1970. The Bicentennial Medals program was created by the Bicentennial Commission on the occasion of the college's 200th anniversary in 1993 to, quote, help build and strengthen ties with alumni, students, faculty, parents, and friends, and to increase their sense of pride in the college. The medals recognize and honor distinguished achievement in any field of endeavor by members of the Williams family. The 172 medal recipients to date span 70 years from the class of 1924 to the class of 2007. Another bicentennial milestone is being celebrated in 2021. Tonight's program is one of a year-long series of events commemorating the 200th anniversary of the founding of the Williams College Society of Alumni. Our society is the oldest alumni association in North America and quite possibly the world. We're spending this bicentennial year not only celebrating and grappling with our past, but also examining our present and imagining our future. Together, we envision an inclusive society where all alumni feel they belong. We are united in our shared commitment to a liberal arts education, to lifelong learning, and most especially to each other and to our college. Tonight, we honor Dr. Craig Smith, and I'll be back at the end of the program to confer the Bicentennial Medal to him. But first, I want to introduce Craig and his partner in conversation this evening, Tara Watson, Professor of Economics and Director of the Williams Public Health Program. Tara Watson is Professor of Economics and Chair of the Program in Public Health. She earned her PhD in economics from Harvard University in 2003 and has been at Williams since 2004. She was a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow in Health Policy Research at the University of Michigan in 2007 to 2009 and served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Microeconomic Analysis at the US Treasury in 2015 to 2016. Professor Watson's work focuses on the US safety net and immigration. Her book, The Border Within, The Economics of Immigration in the Age of Fear, is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press later this year. Tonight's honoree, Dr. Craig Smith, class of 1970, earned his MD at Case Western Reserve University before going on to a general surgery internship and residency and a vascular surgery fellowship at the University of Rochester Medical Center. He completed his cardiothoracic surgery residency at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in 1984, immediately joining the faculty of the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. He became a full professor of surgery in 1998, and in 2010, Dr. Smith became chair of Department of Surgery, a role he continues to hold, and we honor him tonight for his leadership in it. A few reminders before turning over our virtual stage to Tara and Craig. First, feel free to utilize the chat as a space to engage with the community and share any reflections or comments you may have. And if you have any questions for Craig, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar at any time during today's talk. We'll have dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, but you can submit your questions as you think of them. Welcome, Tara and Craig.
Thank you, Maud.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Craig. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
My pleasure.
I wanted to start by talking about your journey towards your current career. You were at Williams, and from what I've read, you took a pretty nonlinear journey to becoming a surgeon. And I always appreciate stories like that because it's important for our students to know that they don't need to have everything figured out right away. And so I'm hoping you could just talk a little bit about your path and how you found yourself where you are today.
It's fair to say that it was nonlinear at certain points. And when I tell the story, I'm always a little cautious about advocating that kind of swerve because not everybody ends up back on the rails. But it was a bit of a swerve. It was very much self-induced. I was a pretty conventional pre-med when I was a freshman, sophomore into my junior year. So I had finished off the pre-med requirements, which was a big advantage to the way things turned out. And then, as happens at places like Williams, I had a genetics professor, Bill DeWitt, who don't know if he's still there. Anyway, at that time, he was a very young, charismatic genetics professor who taught genetics in a very unusual way. He taught you the elegance and the creativity in experimental science. And you learned genetics through the experiments that have been done to show it. It was really quite an innovative way to teach the subject. And he planted the seed that maybe that was much more interesting. And some of you who've been through this may know that science PhDs, if they sense that they've captured the attention of one of those boring pre-meds, they tend to encourage you. So I began to get, that usually unstated belief from them that doctors are just technicians, the real things in the world are cured by scientists who solve things for billions of people, not one person at a time. And I started drinking the Kool-Aid, and by the time I was moving into my senior year, I decided to be more serious about biology. I set up an honors thesis with Professor Grant that I would do on this farm we were living on in Pownell, which is the whole story in itself. It was such a mess that my thesis, I keep hoping there'll be a fire or a flood in the biology. Get rid of my thesis chasing these mice around this farm. All I learned was that if I made a cozy nest, they would become my tenants. So in any event, I got that done, and then I was off to graduate school. This all sounded like a great path. And that was the beginning of my, sort of a few degrees at a time, turn in the wrong direction. My misunderstanding of myself. I ended up very disappointed with where I was accepted to graduate school. I had Professor Grant blowing sunshine in my ear every day about how I go to the best places. He was going to get me into Harvard and so forth. And the best I did was a position at Berkeley, which is a great place, but without a fellowship until I'd shown that I could do it. So they were going to give me sort of a trial. Well, I think I had a moment where I talked to myself about, what does that really say? I mean, they're probably reading me better than I'm reading myself, and decided that maybe I shouldn't go all the way, drag my new wife, who had just given up her law school acceptance at UVA, to go with me, drag her to California. So Professor Grant pulled some strings and got me a fellowship at Dartmouth, which is not exactly a superstar biology platform, but it was nonetheless a position with a full stipend and so forth. And it definitely had some smart people. So off I went to graduate school. I think I knew within weeks that it was a bad choice, but it took me 2 years to extract myself from it. I did end up getting seduced by a project in biophysics, which I won't bore you with, but it was fascinating. And my epiphany came sitting in the cold room one day. I'd set up the apparatus, I developed a hypothesis, I built the apparatus, tested it a few times, and I was sitting there one day and I realized this is going to work. I'm correct about this. It's going to work. And then I realized I'll spend another year or two here running all the experiments and getting somebody to help me do all the complicated math, which I was so bad at. And then maybe I'll get a postdoc, or maybe I'll be competing for a job as a biology teacher and football coach in Lebanon High School or something. And just said, and I decided I was going to quit. So I explained to my thesis advisor that I was quitting. He was not pleased, to say the least. And off I went. He did keep in touch to some extent. And like 20 years later, he sent me a note with a paper. Somebody had gone ahead and done what I was proposing to do and shown I was right. So it's probably the most minor of minor footnotes in biophysics, but nonetheless, somebody had picked up what I was doing and did it. So then I needed a job. I think in my own mind, it was already clear I was going to go to medical school. I didn't share that with anybody. I'm not sure why, but I don't think I did. I suspect my wife knew, because she knows me very well. So I needed a job. So the best local job available to me at the time was a telephone lineman in White River Junction. So I spent a little over a year working as a telephone lineman in White River Junction. And that was great year, really. I mean, what an experience. Really hard work. somewhat dangerous work, not as dangerous as the steel mill work I'd done, but dangerous enough and very hard work, very highly motivated, wonderful people. I just worked all over the territory from Woodstock to Fairmont, Fairleigh, and so on. Some great experiences. And then during that time, I went off interviewing for medical schools and got in and went in. And then medical school was so uncomplicated. People have asked me what was the best part of my sort of adult life, or the easiest part. The easiest part by far was medical school. Absolutely no motivational issues. I knew why I was there. I had to learn a body of knowledge. I was going to learn that body of knowledge. It just was fun and relatively easy. I mean, it was work, but there were no motivational issues whatsoever. And then the rest you've heard in the bio. So my day job, I'm a heart surgeon.
Great. All right. So fast forward to today through that nonlinear path. You're a surgeon and leading this unit at Columbia, and COVID comes up. So you started in March of 2020 writing letters to your staff about the crisis that was unfolding before your eyes. They started out as daily letters. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about these messages that you started writing, which are available for anyone who's interested on the Columbia website. And what inspired you to start writing them? And then how did you make sense of all the uncertainty in those very early days when no one really had a good sense of what was going on?
Well, the two questions are connected, because the uncertainty and the terror that went along with it was one of the motivations for starting to write. But at a purely practical level, that second week, full week in March, it just was, everything was such a mess. I mean, it was becoming evident that we really could have run out of PPE and had people taking care of sick patients with nothing to wear. We already had nurses going through an entire shift in the ER with one mask, one pair of gloves, one gown. And we were that week operating with, instead of coming in and out of the room periodically as we do, we go in at the beginning of the case and stay 6-8 hours, the entire team, no breaks, no lunch, nothing, and finish the case just to save PPE. And it was something none of us had ever experienced or even imagined. And that was exacerbated by the fact that there were all these pronouncements coming out every 10 minutes from university, from the hospital, from the state, from the federal government, 1,000-word emails describing chaos. So I realized people needed to be pulled together a little bit, but I also realized they needed information. And I flattered myself that I could maybe summarize more succinctly what was so confusing. So it really started as a way to rally myself as much as anything else, but to rally us for this task ahead, but also very much to deliver information and simplify this morass of confusing information that was out there. Because it was really, I made the mistake tonight of skimming back through some of those. I have an annotated copy of it that my brother made for me. And every time I do it, I'm kind of overwhelmed. Who did I think I was? Because they really start cranking after a week or so. But in the beginning, it was relatively simple. It got more complicated once I realized I suddenly had this audience.
Right. So thinking back to that time when you're in a situation with so little information, on a day-to-day basis, how are you making decisions about what to do? We didn't really understand how the disease was transmitted. Treatment options weren't really well understood at that time. We didn't know how dangerous it was to staff in the hospital. So how did you think about making those tough decisions with so little to go?
Well, a lot of that was not my decision. I wasn't responsible I didn't bear the burden of a lot of those decisions all by myself. I will say, although there was a lot of confusion, the institutions, the university and the hospital did step up with frequent communications. Once we realized we couldn't be sitting together in a big room, we had Zooms like 4 times a day. new information, all the breaking information, and a lot of brainstorming over what to do. And we were talking about this a little bit before we got started tonight. I think we both knew more than we realized and maybe less than we realized leading up to the real terrifying part of the surge when the cases in our ICU were doubling every day or two. We'd thought, well, this is going to be like SARS and MERS. You know, we know those. So there are certainly familiar aspects of this virus. It's a coronavirus. You know, we know about coronavirus, and it is a standard coronavirus in many respects. And we knew about SARS and MERS, and we figured it'll be like SARS and MERS, and not realizing that it was going to be so easily transmitted asymptomatically, and that there would be, in SARS and MERS, there were very few asymptomatic patients.
Right.
They're much easier to contain. And we figured, well, follow that path and they'll contain it over, and we won't have to worry about it. And then once it got loose in the US, well, then we had this PPE problem, which we had never experienced. I had never thought about PPE. I put a mask on, take it off, I put another mask on, and suddenly it's all gone.
Right.
And so we just had to, but what are you going to do? We had to conserve what we had. So the policies were created on the fly as sensibly as we could. You get one N95 mask and you wear it until it's filthy. And so that's what we did. What else could we do?
Right.
And that is what people did. And people stepped up in amazing ways.
I imagine one challenge in that situation is keeping morale up when people feel like they don't have the equipment they need to do their work. And that also seemed to be an important piece of your letters. An important goal of your letters was to try to boost morale. I was hoping to read just a little snippet from one of them in March. You wrote, remember that our families, friends, and neighbors are scared, idle, out of work, and feel impotent. Anyone working in healthcare still enjoys the rapture of action. It's a privilege. We must mush on. So I'm wondering how you felt about maintaining that level of enthusiasm, morale boosting, confidence. Was it tough for you to sort of project that image? And what other challenges did you come up against in trying to keep morale high so people would continue to be willing and able to do what needed to be done?
I think in the beginning, it didn't feel like a challenge because the need to inspire, reassure seemed so obvious. That's my job. You know, I figured that's what I've got to do. And that little snippet that you just read was the one that got tweeted, and then suddenly everybody was reading. But that one, and I've told many people this, I don't know if anybody believes me, but those 6 little sentences took me about 3 minutes to write because it seemed so obvious. What else would you say in that situation? And I thought the Balto story was very well known. Turns out maybe it's not as well known as I thought. So I thought this was kind of a throwaway. But then I have to say that the inspirational part of it became a more conscious objective as time went on, and a more difficult objective during the tough. If you knew what was going on in some of these, you'd know when the crises occurred. The time that one of my faculty, a guy I'd worked with for years, was suddenly intubated and then on ECMO. And once he was on ECMO, he had a 20% chance of surviving. That was a rough day. And if you know that day, it's very clear in my update. That was another one that one was tough to write because it felt so personal. And I made it kind of personal by talking, I drew in a metaphor or an analogy to the challenges I encounter personally in the operating room sometimes. And it didn't take very long to write, but I sat on that one most of the day thinking, do I share like that? I'm not that sharing kind of a person. And finally hit send and got away with it. Nobody hauled me off, but it was, as I said, when I reread them, I think, who did you think you were? I was really reaching there for some theatrics, but it seemed to work, and it was sincere. I mean, that's what I was feeling. I was just writing.
Right. I'm hoping we can turn to some bigger picture questions about the pandemic. One thing I've been thinking about a lot are the very striking disparities in the impacts of COVID, especially by race and ethnicity lines. Blacks, Latinos, people identifying as American Indian or Alaskan Native, all these groups have really experienced shockingly higher death rates as non-Hispanic whites. And of course, this is in a context of well-documented health disparities that exist outside of COVID as well. And I'm wondering how you've thought about these disparities in the COVID context, and also maybe more generally, just thinking about hospitals and your role as a physician, how you think about ensuring healthcare access, which of course is not the whole story when it comes to health disparities, but is one component that you might be closer to. So how do we think about the role of hospitals in these structural inequities?
Well, this is a dangerous topic for me to discuss with an economics professor who specializes in healthcare. So I'll do my best. But my perspective on that is undeniably warped or biased by the place I work,
Sure.
which is not a prototypical US hospital. It's not even a prototypical US academic medical center. We are, it's one of the things that kept me there, and one of the things that keeps a lot of people at the place. It's such a complex environment. We are sitting in the middle of disparities. So
Right.
addressing, it's not like we have to address them. They come in our door and we live in the middle of them. So I guess that gives me the excuse sometimes to be sanctimonious about the fact that at my job, we take care of these people every day. And maybe they don't at the Mayo Clinic or at the Cleveland Clinic. So, but the issue of the disparities is very complicated. And I think it showed up in COVID. COVID held up a mirror to us, held up a mirror to our society. And this is what we see. Well, that's out there every day. So it's just, I mean, I spent a summer in Alaska working at the Native Health Center years ago. Same issues there, as I'm sure anybody who's studied the native health systems know. Some very conscientious people working in the native health systems, but getting the people in from Kotzebue and whatever, I mean, and just dealing with the cultural differences, and it's very challenging with the best of motivations. And there's the economics of healthcare, whatever my virtuous situation might be sitting in Washington Heights, the economics of healthcare don't make this any easier, because if all we wanted to do was take care of the underserved, we wouldn't survive. We would be one of the, well, that is what the five HCA or HHA, whatever, I forget the city hospitals, the five city hospitals in Manhattan do. And they just bleed money, and they're supported by the city. Yep. And they millions and millions and millions of dollars every year to support them, because they can't make any money. So that if all we did was pay doctors on the basis of Medicare, Medicaid, we couldn't stay open. And so you have to have this, broader approach to bring in commercial insurance that helps you support the other part of the mission. Is that the way it should be? That's way above my pay grade.
It might be more than we have time for tonight. I wanted to ask you about another big picture question as well, which is about technology. One of your letters, you talked about how this moment of crisis might spur innovation or spur technological change, so sort of a silver lining. And we've certainly seen that in many elements of our everyday lives, the way we've all become familiar with Zoom, where we weren't before. But in one of your letters, you were specifically referring to split ventilators as a sort of invention by necessity in order to use resources most efficiently. So I'm wondering if you can think about innovation in this crisis and what you've seen that you think might be useful going forward.
Well, as I said in that particular update, crises, well, in surgery, wars and natural disasters are classically stimulants for innovation. And so this is a different one. This is a stimulant for medical innovation. And we're sitting on the sidelines as surgeons cheering them on. And the example about the split ventilators is an interesting one because it was developed by surgeons to deal with mass trauma and was utilized, done experimentally in Detroit in animals, getting 4 dogs on one ventilator. And then a guy who happened to know about this was covering the Sunrise Hospital emergency room in Las Vegas when the victims of that shooting came in. And this guy suddenly had 215 people coming in his emergency room and knew about this experiment and had some people on split ventilators. So it was innovation aimed at surgery, in that case used to treat trauma victims, that we were now going to use for pandemic victims. So it makes a great story, and we really got energized about it. We were working on it day and night for a week or so to try to see how useful it would be. Long story short, as many people predicted, it wasn't that useful because of the physiologists on this, if there are any, will know the compliance balance between 2 different patients is a real challenge. But so it was really tricky and wasn't in the long run very useful. But at that same time, there were all kinds of exciting things going on. The engineering school came up in about 3 days. They came up with a 3D printing method for creating face masks. The engineering school and some others were working on ways to sterilize masks, even the throwaway mask, and they were looking at autoclave methods and this and that, radiation, and they were coming up with ways to conserve our PPE. Amazingly, like in a week or two, they had all these solutions. That turned out that the supply problem was solving itself while they were doing all this, but the creativity was astonishing. And the virologists and the geneticists who were working out, and you look at the vaccines themselves.
Yeah.
What an amazing story.
Right.
So.
It's a good example. As you wrote these letters, I'm wondering how people responded. Did you hear back from people? Did you get any pushback? Did people give you a sense that they were helping? And now that you look back on them, how do you feel about them? Are you glad you did them? And maybe you could also talk a little bit about why you stopped a couple months after you started, and they sort of slowed to a trickle. I know you're still doing occasional updates, but you know, that whole experience of writing these letters and then becoming sort of in the public eye, I'm wondering how you reflect back on that.
Well, the feedback was overall enormously positive, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. I think if I'd gotten a couple of the bad feedbacks the first day, that would have been the end of me. Because I'm just not, this is not what I do, and it wouldn't have taken a lot to shake my confidence as an oracle. But it was pretty overwhelmingly positive. I did get the predictable call, like 10 minutes after that Balto thing went viral. I got the predictable call from the #2 person in the New York Presbyterian, foaming at the mouth about how dare I share this information. But it was I knew this was coming. It was a familiar tussle between them and us over who controls the information. And so we parted as friendly as we ever are. And she knew she couldn't stand in my way anyway, so she put up with it. And thankfully, they went on and got good reception. But it wasn't all positive. And I think every time I tried to sting somebody in those, I heard about it. And like when I stung MSK for trying to keep themselves, you know, in a sort of a bubble and keep treating all their patients as if nothing was happening. And when I tried to sting NYU for claiming that all their staff had been tested, I heard about that like the next day. And MSK was threatening to sue me and all these things. And I realized, yes, I made my point. And everybody on my side of the argument said, yeah, you taught them a lesson. But was it really worth it? I'm not sure it was. And I got a couple of, like when I wrote the thing about, what's his name? Something Jordan, the former president of Stanford. I'd found this just interesting story about the guy, that he had this fish collection, and it was a fantastic fish collection. It got burned in lightning in Indiana. He took it to Stanford, and it got flooded or something at Stanford. He lost it twice and rebuilt it each time. I thought that was an inspirational story of rebuilding his collection. Turns out somebody the next day, or that night, emails about, did I know he was a eugenicist? I had no idea he was a eugenicist, but I guess I do now. And so I should have just been, I guess, paying closer attention. So I guess those kinds of slips are inevitable. I think in total, I was very satisfied with them. I can't pretend I wasn't. They were, I still, when I look back on it, how did I pull that off? 59 in a row. And so why did I stop is another part of your question.
Right.
Well, I knew I had to stop sooner or later, especially once I started working again. I mean, doing my real work. There just aren't enough hours in the day.
Right.
Once we started, so I sort of saw this coming and I was kind of plotting it out. I also wanted to end on a prime, and I did on 59. So,
Nice.
but that was also happened to be the day we started scheduling elective cases again. And it was beginning to feel a little bit self-conscious, which I said in the last one.
Right.
A little bit too much of a performance. And I think if I try to go on, and then I'm just some journalist. You know? So I don't know how they do it, frankly.
Yeah, I don't either. So as we reflect now back on the pandemic, obviously it's not over, but we sort of have a lot of experience to think about now. I'm wondering if you've thought about what we could do better next time. And I don't mean just literally what we could do better next time for the next coronavirus pandemic, but sort of more broadly, what can we learn about responding to new emerging crises that we might not have all the answers to right away?
Well, I have thought about that quite a bit because it's a really kind of an interesting problem, which has made me reflect on the difference between prevention and preparation. Prevention is relatively simple. And if you understand cause and effect, then you can prevent, typically. And a vaccination is a prevention. And we've actually done extraordinarily well with this new technology, setting ourselves up to be able to have vaccines against future infectious crises that might make us much more nimble, whether it's SARS or something else. So that's fine if we're planning the next war based on this war, which is, which is the trap, because preparedness requires planning for the unknown. And so that's where it gets tougher. There's some lessons we learned this time around. We can't rely on just-in-time inventory. There has to be some kind of a stockpile. We can't rely on other countries to be our source, at least not totally. So there has to be some kind of a stockpile, which my friend Bill Clinton started in 1998 so presciently after reading that trashy novel. And but he did it. He set it up well, and that was actually pretty effective. And it was allowed to kind of dwindle. But we need things like that. But that's the easy part of preparedness. I mean, you have the go bag and the push kit and all that. The harder thing is to know what is the next crisis. What part of the next crisis is going to be the thing we don't understand at all.
Right.
And how do you prepare for the truly unknown? Because there's always some element of these things that's unknown. People flying planes into buildings. Who thought?
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. It's been really great to hear your perspective on all of these things I've been thinking about with respect to the crisis. I think it's the time of the evening where we turn to the Q&A. So I hope those of you who are watching tonight will feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat, but the actual Q&A that you see there. And we'll try to get as many questions as we can answered in the next few minutes. I'm going to start with a question from Leah Bush, who was a student here a few years ago. And she says, thank you, Dr. Smith and Professor Watson. Dr. Smith, do you think of empathy as an emotion or a cognition? What can we do to cultivate empathy in ourselves, our colleagues, and our communities?
That's a very interesting question. a large part of me thinks that empathy is something you're either born with or you learn very early in life. And that if you really don't have it, it's hard to teach. There's just, in the people who truly lack empathy, there's just seems to be something missing. But of course, you tend to figure that out when they're relatively far along in life, and you can't usually unwind the tape and figure out who dropped them on their head at the wrong moment. You go back and fix that. So I'm inclined to think it's more, I forget how you put it now, a cognition or emotion. I think it's probably both, but it's an interesting dichotomy you're setting up there. I'm going to fail to help you there.
Well, that just means it's a really good question, Leah. Thank you. Next, we have a message from Melissa asking what kind of mental health support exists for doctors, nurses, and staff who are suffering from PTSD as a result of being on the front line during the pandemic and the hardship that brings about.
That's also a very good question that I'm glad somebody asked. There has been absolutely no lack of that, at least where I am. We have a very famous, enormous psychiatry department, and psychology downtown. They immediately pitched in. So within a week or so, we had a service they called COPE, C-O-P-E, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It was available to doctors, nurses, anyone, 24/7. They had people available to answer calls, come meet with people. They had, which has been, not everybody took advantage of it. It was certainly not required, but many people did. They held periodic Zoom gatherings with larger groups of on the front lines and so on. And so many of our psychiatrists were showing up on doing rotations in the emergency room to help people deal with the stresses down there of triaging, putting people in a corner to die and sending someone off who's never going to see their family again. So they had people actively involved in helping with all of that. So it really was, and it's going on now. I just finished, they're still sending around questionnaires. I just finished my 6-month questionnaire, filling out, 3 pages of my mental health, which I hope is pretty good. But that actually was very well covered.
That's great to hear. A related question is about the impact on younger healthcare providers. This is from Dennis, asking about people like residents, med students, younger nurses, techs, etc. What is likely to happen to their professional paths? Will they be forever changed by these experiences so early in the career? And do you think there'll be any changes to medical education coming out of this crisis?
Another excellent question. These must all be Williams people asking these questions.
Obviously.
Well, I think it's a little hard to say, but my guess is that they will be impacted more positively than negatively. That's certainly my impression from my young people, which is my residents. Students are a different story, but my residents in surgery, they were, I think, overworked almost to death, but they were energized by the mission in a way that was something they'll probably always value. That's my guess. How much that will change their attitudes and so on, I don't know. And whether it'll change education itself, I don't know. I think it was a shame that the medical schools, I think all of them or most of them, made a conscious decision to keep medical students completely out of it. Medical students were dying to get into the fray. They could have done so many things. And they were saying, oh, no, they were not allowed to get involved in anything clinical. So they were doing database stuff and this and that. I felt like reminding them they should go over and look at the plaque on the wall in the medical school where there's the names of 6 medical students who died in the tuberculosis epidemic in the 1800s. I think a lot of medical students thought that's their mission. That's why they're here.
Right.
They were kept out of it. And most of the ones I know, of course, it's maybe only the ones who speak to me, felt badly about that.
Interesting. I assume that was for their own personal protection.
Yes, yes.
We have a couple of questions about the literary nature of the letters that you wrote. So one question here from Sarah Wilson asks, who was your favorite English professor at Williams? And another question from Suji about whether you could share any literary influences or past experiences that have informed your style of writings. Suji notes your writings were noted for their style and prose as well. So any thoughts about the writing itself? And I also noticed you had a lot of literary references and definitely celebrating the liberal arts tradition in your letters. So if you could comment on that a little, that would be great.
Well, first of all, I'm flattered by those kinds of comments. And I appreciate you taking the time to say so. Easy to say who my favorite English professor was. It was Clay Hunt, who's long since gone, but he taught a poetry course that was legendary then. It was one of the most seminal. I waited since I wasn't an English major. I took it when I was a senior. It's kind of going in my schedule. It was phenomenal. And it was so good, I took his Dante course in the spring. And for several years, I reread the Inferno, at least, not the other two, on Easter weekend, because as you probably know, it starts on Good Friday and ends on. So I did that for several years. Don't do that anymore. But he was a really inspiring professor, and I won't go into all the reasons why. He was a very odd guy. But I can't say that he influenced my writing, and I think my writing is a combination of all the things I've read all my life. I've always read a lot, and I do actually have to write a lot professionally. And I guess all the little quotes and so forth that I started collecting those about 12, 13 years ago when I realized there was an easy way to do it. The notes function on the iMac is an easy way to collect notes. I had to give a presidential address for my professional society, and I had 3 years to prepare for it. That was torture. But over those 3 years, I started collecting all these things. I'm always reading this and that, and so I started collecting. I have thousands of these things. Wow. So it was almost a greater challenge to be judicious about their use than to come up with them. So that makes it sound kind of mechanical and uninspiring. So I probably disappointed all of you.
No, not at all. I have a couple of questions here about vaccines. So one is there's a growing debate on offering COVID vaccinations and related treatments to the undocumented population. This is something I'm also interested in, given my own research interests. This is from Robert. And then also from Donald, what arguments can you make to people who don't want to take the vaccine? Were there people in your hospital who don't want to be vaccinated? And how do you address that?
Well, if I'm reading this correctly, it looks like the question about the undocumented is coming from my old friend and classmate, Bob Groban. So thank you, Bob, for still hanging in there. It's a great question. And I would say the goal they're citizens of the world. And the goal here is to get vaccinations into every citizen in the world. So how we do it is less important. I think in a way it's unfortunate that we've taken such an identity-based approach to rolling out the vaccines. And we're so, when I do this, it takes 2 times as long to fill out the EPIC EMR paperwork as it does to do the injection. Whereas back when I was a kid, we're getting polio injections. They just lined you up and bang, bang, bang. They do, 1,000 people in 20 minutes or something.
Right.
In a way, that's what we need to do and be a little less fussy about it. So if we pulled undocumented people out of the line at Starbucks and stuck a needle in them and got them vaccinated, that would be fine with me. Now, I realize we'd be cutting corners. Do they have allergies? Are they going to be in the 6%? Are they going to be one of the? We would be cutting some corners, but that's what we have to do: is get the world vaccinated.
Yeah.
I forgot the other question, which I've already.
Arguments to people who might be hesitant.
Yes, that is a problem, and it's a problem for my people, my coworkers, and it's tragic in a way. It comes back to what you asked me a little while ago about inequities.
Right.
It's just who you would think. It's our housekeeping staff. It's our OR techs, most of whom are Black or Hispanic, who have some concerns. So in the first week or two that the medical staff was eligible, doctors and nurses, for the most part, lined up and were vaccinated quickly. And if you plotted percent vaccination against income, it was an absolute straight line. So lower income, they don't want to be vaccinated. So that just seems so tragic in a way. And so we're getting all the vaccinations. So persuading them otherwise is not easy, but it's persuasion. You know, I worked on 3 of the guys who've worked with me for years in the OR, and just kind of asked them if they'd gotten it. And they said, no. I said, I'm going to wait till July. I said, why are you going to wait? I said, well, maybe I'll do it in April. And eventually he and the other 2 guys all came in together and got vaccinated, but it wasn't because we beat on them. It just kept keeping it in front of them in some way. I didn't use this argument a lot, but a lot of the people who did tell me it was very effective, telling people about the potential for a passport that would get you into sporting events, on airplanes. Now, of course, that's becoming controversial now, but it was a little more persuasive then. And some people said, oh, that's true. So that was the tipping point for some. But it's not easy, and it remains a problem.
Yeah, I think, I teach about health disparities, and I think the history of the way some medical institutions have behaved over time, especially in the past, but not exclusively in the past, it brings up legitimate concerns for some populations with trust. So I think, it's definitely a challenge. We have a couple of questions here about your, I don't know exactly how to characterize it, your ways of coping yourself with the pandemic, I guess is the right way. So one is from Julia, who also notes she's the BFF of your sister-in-law, Melissa. How did you relieve stress during March and April and May of 2020? And then May, who's also a recent student, asks, what new habits, systems, or processes have worked well for you, for your organization in the past year that you'll be bringing forward? So different coping mechanisms, I guess.
The second one's a little more pragmatic. The first one, I have to say, it was not, maybe because of what I do, I'm accustomed to coping pretty well with emotional ups and downs of people dying and what have you. And that in and of itself was not so difficult. It was very difficult dealing with people who were dying alone. And that was probably the most painful part of this, was so many people just swept off from the emergency room to a bed somewhere, no visitors because we didn't have enough PPE to allow visitors. And 10 days later, they're gone and they're in a freezer somewhere, and no funeral. The lack of closure was really tough. And I can't say I felt it personally so much, but I felt it for them. And I was pretty busy doing these things every day, but also just going and making rounds and trying to keep people bucked up and operating now and then. And so I had plenty to do. And I didn't find, I hate to say, I don't think I found coping to be a huge challenge, at least personally, because I had plenty to do. The next question, there are a lot of things that we will, even just being conservative about the use of supplies. I don't think it'll be a long time before we get back to our profligate ways, even when we're swimming in supplies right now. But that's going to be a hard lesson to unlearn. Other things, I think the need for recognizing what you have to do if there's suddenly a demand on your ICU capacity, that was a sobering lesson. And we now have in place a number of levels of potential ramp up in ICU space that we wouldn't have if we hadn't gone through this. We hope never to have to go there again. Turning the operating rooms into ICUs was a nightmare. We certainly hope never to do that again. But I'm not giving you a very good answer to that.
No, I think that does help. We have time for just another question or two. So I'm going to end with one from Ted, who says, "Thank you, Dr. Smith. I wish I'd known you at Williams. Your thoughtful posts have helped many of us maintain perspective through an unimaginably difficult time. How shall we include training the humanities as important qualities in those contemplating medicine as a career?"
Well, that's a good question. And that comes from a guy who's even older than I am, I see, by a couple of years. And thank you for saying so. I mean, this is an example of the kind of positive reinforcement I got that kept me going. So thank you for saying that. I don't know that there's definitely more humanities or what they call narrative medicine that's part of the curriculum, or at least available as an adjunct to the curriculum today in medical education than there was when you and I were educated, when there was, I'd say, none of that. And you were either a person who read outside medicine and had interest in art or whatever, or you weren't. Today, that is much more consciously available, certainly at Columbia, and I suspect at most places that aren't in big artsy metropolitan areas. And some of the creativity you see among these people is pretty astonishing. The guy who runs my media operation as his day job is a regular cartoonist for the New Yorker. And he's a big part of narrative medicine. He does some really great sort of semi-medical cartoons. He actually went through a medical internship before quitting to become a cartoonist. Very interesting guy. And there are quite a few of those people sprinkled around. Whether it needs to be part of the curriculum in some more formal way, I didn't feel the lack of it, but maybe I had too much of it in my backpack to begin with. So.
Great, thanks. I'm being told we have actually time for one more. So let's take this one from Kathy, who is an occupational health director in a hospital. She says she's constantly asked to help build stronger resilience, especially as we get through the third wave. She says, "This feels trite in many ways. What tips do you have for resilience of healthcare workers?"
That's an interesting observation, and I share your concern. And it is, there's certainly no silver bullet I have to offer you for that. And as I said in one of my things, where we were going to crack and almost did and are cracking most now is at the bottom of the pyramid: nursing, physical therapists, respiratory therapists, who do so much of the real work. That is where we're most vulnerable. And it's even more true now. I don't know what you're seeing where you are, Kathy, but our nursing is really stretched. And we're losing them left and right, quitting and so forth, scrambling to replace them. And it's really tenuous. And I wish I could say what, it's popular to talk about grit and so forth. I don't know how you teach grit to people in a situation like this. And the resilience probably comes from all feeling like you're working together and for the right goals, but that tends to fade a bit too as you get past the adrenaline strike of the first punch and into the second surge. It's much tougher, and it really has felt that way in New York too.
Thanks. Well, I'm sorry to those of you whose questions are very interesting, but we didn't have time to get to them tonight. But I do want to thank you, Dr. Smith, for having this conversation with me. It's been really fascinating, and I'm confident that the audience here has found it very fascinating as well.
Well, thank you for guiding me so deftly through the weeds here.
Take care.
Thank you so much. Can we all please give a virtual round of applause for Tara and Craig? It's now my honor to confer the college's Bicentennial Medal to Dr. Craig Smith, Williams class of 1970. You and John Keats can now both be called physician writers. Unlike you, Keats never performed quadruple bypass on a former president. But like him, you found later in your career the power of words to elevate the human spirit. They were extraordinary words for an extraordinary time. COVID-19 had thrust our world into anxiety and despair, especially among medical professionals who felt overwhelmed by the mounting death and too often powerless to respond. As chair of the Department of Surgery at one of the world's premier health centers, you began to write daily briefings that not only reported with clarity the cascading challenges, but helped your colleagues to see the nobility of their efforts and gave them reason to hope. In doing that for them, you did it for all of us as readers who felt moved to share these letters widely, until in time, people around the world couldn't wait for your next dose of uplift. One of the many people you inspired called them the Winston Churchill speeches of this war. As you have pointed out in one of them, Dante in the Divine Comedy emerged from the underworld just before dawn, as we hope that our world is now doing from the darkness of COVID. But however far in the future people look back to learn the best of our generation's response to this crisis, they will find themselves savoring your eloquence, because a thing of beauty is a joy forever. In recognition of your distinguished achievement in humanistic healthcare, Williams College is proud to honor you with its Bicentennial Medal. If we were in person, I would place the medal over Craig's head, but I'm simply going to pass the medal from Williamstown to Craig in New York. So Craig, I send it over to you. There's amazing how we did that. Thanks again for being here with us tonight. Please join me on Tuesday, May 11th at 8 p.m. when we'll honor Nancy Baker Cahill, class of 1992. Nancy's an artist working at the intersection of fine art, new media, and activism, and is the founder of the artistic director of Fourth Wall, a free augmented reality public art platform exploring resistance and creative free expression. She'll be joining conversation with fellow Bicentennial medalist Ethan Zuckerman, class of 1993. I hope to see you then, if not before. Have a good evening. Bye from Williamstown.
Thank you.